You know, sometimes a statement just cuts through all the noise and makes you sit up straight.
Mm.
Former President Trump's recent suggestion to blow up Iran's nuclear centrifuges, that definitely did that.
Yeah, it certainly got attention.
It immediately raises so many urgent questions, doesn't it? You know, what are the ripple effects for global stability? What could it do to energy prices? And I guess most worrying, what's the potential for this to spark a major conflict?
It really does. It's a statement that gets right to the core of a very long, very complex international issue.
Yeah.
So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack that idea.
Okay.
We'll look at the history that led us here, the technical side of Iran's nuclear program, the diplomatic efforts, what's worked, what hasn't, and the really serious implications of even thinking about military action.
Right.
Our aim is really just to give you a clear, comprehensive understanding of what's truly at stake here.
Because let's face it, when you hear about nuclear programs, international treaties, it can all feel a bit abstract, right? A bit distant from everyday life.
It can, yeah.
But the reality is the decisions, even just the words used around these issues, they can have very real consequences that touch all of us. So our goal isn't to drown you in details, but to cut through that complexity, give you the essential context you need to understand why this matters.
Exactly.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, where does the story of Iran's nuclear ambitions actually start? It wasn't always this hostile, was it?
No, interestingly, it goes back much further than many people realize, all the way to the 1950s.
The 50s? Wow.
Yeah, under the Atoms for Peace initiative, the United States actually supported Iran's early civilian nuclear program back when the Shah was in power.
So a total turnaround from today.
Complete turnaround. Yeah. The fundamental shift, as you'd expect, came after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. That event just dramatically changed the dynamic, and it led to this growing suspicion, the skepticism in the West, about what Iran was really up to with its nuclear plans.
Right. And that skepticism, it really built up over time, didn't it? I remember those reports about undisclosed nuclear facilities back in 2002 that really set off alarm bells internationally.
Huge alarm bells. And then you fast forward to 2015 and you get the big nuclear deal, the JCPOA.
The landmark agreement, but clearly not the end of the story.
Not even close. The U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 under Trump, that was a really pivotal moment.
Yeah.
And in response, Iran started to, well, gradually step over the deal's limits.
Yeah.
Eventually, by 2020, enriching uranium up to 60% purity.
Okay, 60%. That sounds high. Why is that specific level so significant?
It's really significant because it dramatically shortens the time Iran would theoretically need to get to weapons-grade material, which is typically 90% or more. It's a big step closer.
Which brings us to this term we hear constantly, centrifuges. These machines seem to be right at the heart of it. What exactly are they doing? Why are they so critical?
Okay, so at their core, centrifuges are these incredibly sophisticated machines. They're designed to separate different types or isotopes of uranium.
Like sorting them out?
Kind of, yeah. Think of it like a really, really high-speed spinning process. The whole goal is to increase the concentration of uranium-235. That's the isotope that can actually sustain a nuclear chain reaction. Natural uranium is mostly U-238, which isn't useful for most reactors or for weapons.
Okay, so it's about refining the uranium, and there's a big difference in the levels of refinement. Right?
Absolutely, huge difference. Low-enriched uranium, maybe around 3 to 5% U-235, that's what you use for civilian nuclear power plants.
Right, fuel.
Exactly. But highly enriched uranium, that's 90% or more U-235. That's what you need for weapons.
And how do the centrifuges actually do that?
Well, the process involves feeding uranium hexafluoride gas, UF6, into these interconnected chains or cascades of centrifuges. They spin incredibly fast, generating massive centrifugal force.
Okay.
This force pushes the slightly heavier U-238 atoms towards the outside wall of the spinning cylinder, while the lighter U-235 atoms tend to concentrate more towards the center. That allows them to be drawn off and separated.
And our sources suggest Iran's capabilities here are pretty advanced now.
Yes, definitely. By 2025, reports suggest Iran is operating well over 13,000 advanced centrifuges. That includes newer, much more efficient models like the IR-6.
IR-6, how much better are they?
Think of the older IR-1s like, I don't know, dial-up internet. They worked, but slowly.
Okay, gotcha.
These newer IR-6s are like fiber optic, dramatically faster, much more efficient. They significantly cut down the time needed to enrich uranium compared to the older machines. And it's way beyond the limits that were set by the JCPOA.
And these centrifuges, they're not just sitting out in the open, are they? Some of these facilities are meant to be pretty secure.
Precisely. Some facilities, like parts of Natanz, have buildings above ground. But a key site like Fordo, that's buried deep inside a mountain.
Wow.
Yeah, offering serious protection against conventional airstrikes.
So this strategic placement, it makes any military plan to just, take out their centrifuge program a very, very complex challenge. Okay, so understanding that technical side, the scale, the protection. Let's circle back to former President Trump's proposed response. Total dismantlement. What does that actually mean in practical terms, and how different is it from the JCPOA approach?
Total dismantlement, as Trump describes it, means Iran would have to completely stop all uranium enrichment activities and destroy its entire stockpile of centrifuges.
All of them. Zero enrichment.
That's the stated goal. It's a much, much tougher position than the JCPOA. Remember, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, aimed to significantly restrict Iran's program in exchange for lifting sanctions.
Right. It had limits on enrichment levels, the number of centrifuges they could run, mostly older ones.
Exactly. And enhanced inspections by the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog. Trump's reason for pulling out was basically that the deal didn't cover things like Iran's ballistic missiles or its regional influence, and he argued the sunset clauses meant Iran could eventually just resume its nuclear activities freely.
Okay, so if we were trying to imagine a new deal based on this tougher stance, maybe learning from the JCPOA's problems, what would it look like? What would the big negotiation points be?
Well, a hypothetical new deal, based on what analysts are saying, would likely push Iran to dismantle a huge chunk, if not all, of its advanced centrifuges, maybe limiting them to, say, 5,000 of the old IR-1s.
So a massive rollback.
Massive. Plus, you'd almost certainly see stricter, longer-lasting caps on their enriched uranium stockpiles way below the JCPOA levels.
Yeah.
And significantly beefed up IAEA inspections, maybe permanent, possibly even including access to military sites, not just declared or nuclear ones.
That sounds like a huge ask.
It is. And crucially, the U.S. and allies would probably insist on tackling those other issues, ballistic missiles, support for regional proxies, things left out of the original JCPOA.
So what would Iran likely demand in return for even considering concessions like that?
Well, their top demand would undoubtedly be the complete verifiable lifting of all those crippling economic sanctions. And learning from what happened with the JCPOA, they'd almost certainly want ironclad guarantees against the U.S. just walking away again.
Makes sense.
And finally, they'd likely insist on keeping at least a minimal civilian nuclear program, maybe some very limited enrichment for research or power. They see it as a matter of national sovereignty, national pride even.
Now, you mentioned sources talking about some recent diplomatic activity, indirect talks in Oman. Is there anything happening there? Any real hope for that kind of diplomatic path?
There have definitely been reports of these indirect talks, yes. In Oman, with mediators shuttling messages back and forth. Some sources hint at, good progress on maybe outlining a framework for future talks. But, and it's a big but, we have to be realistic about the huge obstacles. Iran has repeatedly said no way to totally dismantling its centrifuges or halting all enrichment. They see it as a sovereign right, and honestly, as key to their regional deterrence.
And on the other side?
On the other side, Trump's very hardline total dismantlement stance leaves very little room for the kind of give and take the compromises usually need in these kinds of negotiations.
And there's a clock ticking too, isn't there? Something about a snapback mechanism in the JCPOA?
Absolutely. A really critical deadline. The JCPOA has this snapback provision. It allows the original signatories, especially the European countries, UK, France, Germany, the E3.
Right.
It allows them to basically unilaterally trigger the reimposition of all the old UN sanctions if they think Iran is seriously violating the deal.
And that deadline is?
October 2025. That's when the mechanism expires. The big worry is if there's no new deal by then and the E3 trigger snapback, Iran might feel backed into a corner. They could react drastically, maybe pull out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT altogether.
Which would be huge.
A massive escalation. It would pretty much signal they're openly going for a weapon.
Our sources mention some expert views, too. Dennis Ross talks about needing permanent structural change. What's he getting at there?
Dennis Ross is essentially arguing that any future deal can't just be about temporary limits. It needs to fundamentally change Iran's nuclear infrastructure to permanently reduce its ability to quickly break out and build a weapon. Getting rid of that threshold threat, as he calls it, the ability to quickly switch from civilian to weapons-grade enrichment.
Okay. And then there's Nason Rafati from the Crisis Group focusing on that 60% enrichment level we talked about.
Right. Rafati makes the point that while enriching to 60% gives Iran quite a bit of leverage in talks, it's a bargaining chip.
Sure.
It also dramatically increases the risk. It makes a military strike by the U.S. or Israel more likely if diplomacy totally fails. So it's a very tricky balancing act for Iran.
Right.
Use the progress to negotiate, but don't push so far you trigger an attack.
And looking back at the JCPOA itself, you mentioned lessons learned. What are the key takeaways from its successes, but also its collapse?
Well, the JCPOA definitely showed that diplomacy could work, at least for a time. It significantly pushed back Iran's potential breakout timeline through verifiable limits. That was a success. But its collapse really highlighted how crucial sustained bipartisan support within the U.S. is for any big international deal like this to stick long term.
Right. Political shifts can undo things.
Exactly. And maybe a future deal needs a broader scope, covering those missiles and regional issues to get wider buy-in and prevent it from being undermined again. Especially now, given Iran's program is more advanced and you have hardliners in Tehran who might actually want a weapon.
So if diplomacy hits a wall, the other option that's been openly talked about, like Trump mentioned, is military action. You said it's complex, but just how risky are we talking? What are the real challenges and potential fallout?
We are talking incredibly risky.
Yeah.
Immense challenges, extraordinarily high potential for things to go very wrong. First off, just hitting the facilities. As we said, Fordo is deep underground. You'd likely need specialized bunker-busting bombs, multiple precise hits. Maybe not even guaranteeing success.
And even the site's partly above ground.
Like Natanz.
Yeah.
They'd be heavily defended. Sophisticated air defense systems. It wouldn't be easy.
And that's just the strike itself. The bigger worry is the response, isn't it? Retaliation.
Yeah, it's a primary concern, absolutely. Iran has many ways to hit back. They could target U.S. bases in the region. They could use proxies like Hezbollah to attack Israel.
And the Strait of Hormuz?
Exactly. Disrupting oil shipments there, which, as we'll get to, would hammer global energy markets instantly.
Beyond that direct retaliation, what about the wider regional picture? Could a strike ignite something bigger?
Very easily. You could see a much wider regional war. Countries like Russia and China, who generally oppose U.S. intervention against Iran, might step up their support for Tehran significantly. Sunni states in the Gulf, they might share concerns about Iran's nukes, but they'd be in a really tough spot, maybe backing the U.S., but terrified of the instability, the heightened sectarian conflict it could unleash.
And the biggest potential consequence?
Perhaps the most dangerous is that a strike might actually backfire. It could push Iran to just abandon all pretense, leave the NPT, and race towards a bomb as a matter of survival.
Right, make the problem worse.
Potentially much worse. And, we also can't ignore the likely strong opposition within the U.S. to getting dragged into another major Middle East conflict.
People sometimes bring up Israel's strike on Iraq's Osirak reactor back in '81. Is that a relevant comparison here?
Not really, no. While Osirak did set back Iraq's program temporarily, the situation with Iran today is fundamentally different.
How so?
Iran's program is vastly bigger, spread across many more sites, much better defended, buried deeper, and technologically far more advanced than Iraq's was then. Plus, Iran's ability to retaliate across the region is incomparably greater than Iraq's was in '81. A quick, clean strike like Osirak, highly unlikely against Iran today.
There's a warning mention from the Atlantic Council about a potential crisis if that snapback happens without a deal. What's their main fear?
Their warning really highlights this deep concern. If those old UN sanctions slam back into place via snapback, and there's no diplomatic process ongoing, no new deal in sight, Iran might just decide that building a bomb is its only real option left for security. That could trigger a really dangerous, unpredictable international crisis.
Interestingly, though, our sources mentioned Trump apparently talking Israel out of a strike plan for May 2025. What does that tell us? Even with his tough talk.
It's very interesting, isn't it? It strongly suggests that even someone like Trump, known for tough rhetoric, recognizes the huge, potentially uncontrollable risks of escalation that military action carries. It implies that at least at that moment, there was still a preference for trying the diplomatic route, however hard that might be.
Okay, so let's widen the lens a bit. How are other key players reacting to all this? Trump's statements, the general tension. What about Israel?
Well, Israel, generally speaking, aligns with Trump's hardline view. They've long pushed for the complete dismantling of Iran's nuclear program.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Absolutely. Although there are some reports hinting at a bit of unease in Israel about, say, the U.S. brokered truce with the Houthis in Yemen, or even these ongoing indirect nuclear talks. Maybe some concern about shifting U.S. priorities or lack of perfect coordination.
And the Europeans, the E3, UK, France, Germany, where do they stand?
The E3 are in a really tricky spot. They're deeply worried about military escalation and the chaos it could cause.
But they're also worried about Iran's progress.
Exactly. They're very concerned about Iran's nuclear advances, and they've said publicly they are ready to trigger that snapback in October if diplomacy fails. So their public message is consistently pushing for diplomacy, trying to avoid what they call a potential chain of escalatory events.
What about the other big global players? China? Russia?
Both China and Russia are strongly against any unilateral U.S. military strike on Iran. China's actually been involved in facilitating some of the indirect talks, and there have even been whispers about Russia potentially importing Iranian uranium down the line. Critically, both have veto power at the UN Security Council. That makes getting new international sanctions through the UN very difficult.
It's not just states, though. What about Iran's regional allies, the proxy groups? How do they fit into this?
Right. Groups like the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Syrian regime, they all rely heavily on Iran for support. Trump's approach seems a bit, well, complex. He made that comment acknowledging Houthi bravery, even while being tough on Iran itself.
Strange juxtaposition.
It suggests maybe a recognition of just how tangled that web of regional relationships really is.
And this whole nuclear issue seems so tied up with a bigger power struggles in the Middle East, doesn't it?
Absolutely central. For Iran, the nuclear program is seen internally as vital for deterrence against rivals like Israel, and maybe a way to project power. Paradoxically, Trump's threats, meant to weaken Iran, could actually strengthen the argument inside Iran that they need this capability for security.
And for other regional players, like Saudi Arabia.
It puts them in a difficult position. Israel likely welcomes a tougher U.S. line on Iran, but they also need to be careful not to alienate Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, especially with normalization talks happening. Everyone wants to avoid a major regional war that destabilizes everything.
And the economic fallout. That's always looming large, isn't it? Even the threat of conflict seems to move markets.
Massively. We already saw oil prices tick up just after Trump's recent statement, a real military strike. With the potential to disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, remember, that's about 20% of the world's oil supply.
20%.
Yeah, prices could easily surge past $100 a barrel. That would hit the global economy hard, and everyone would feel it in higher energy costs.
Okay, so looking ahead, our sources lay out a few potential paths forward. What are the main scenarios we should be thinking about?
Broadly, there seem to be three main scenarios. First, the optimistic one. A new nuclear deal gets negotiated and actually works.
What would that involve again?
Likely limits on centrifuges, caps on enrichment, maybe some sanctions relief.
Yeah.
But the big risk there is hardliners, and both the U.S. and Iran could torpedo it.
Okay, scenario 2.
Scenario 2. Diplomacy fails. The E3 triggers snapback sanctions in October 2025. This could really provoke Iran. Maybe they leave the NPT, ramp up enrichment, lash out regionally. The risk of military escalation goes way up.
And the third, most worrying scenario?
Direct military intervention. A strike by the U.S. or Israel targeting nuclear sites. It might set the program back temporarily, but the risk of triggering a wider, longer regional war is extremely high and probably wouldn't be a clean victory, plus likely global condemnation.
Are there any specific ideas floating around to try and de-escalate, to steer away from those worst-case outcomes?
Yeah, analysts have suggested a few things. One idea is just to buy more time, extend the diplomatic window, maybe find a way to delay that October 2025 snapback deadline like the Arms Control Association suggests, give talks more chance.
Any others?
Another strategy is to bring China and Russia more actively into the diplomatic fold. Use their influence with Iran, maybe talk about future civilian nuclear cooperation or uranium exports, and some suggest addressing Iran's core security worries more directly. Maybe assurances against regime change to reduce their perceived need for a nuclear deterrent.
Of course, Trump's tough stance, explicitly mentioning military options, has drawn plenty of criticism. What are the main arguments against this approach?
Well, one big criticism is that provocative language like blow up centrifuges just raises the temperature. It risks accidents, miscalculations, and makes finding diplomatic common ground even harder. The Washington Post noted Iran tends to react badly to perceived bullying.
Right.
Another argument is that total dismantlement might just be unrealistic. Iran's invested too much, and many there, possibly Khamenei himself, see some nuclear capability as essential for national pride and deterrence. Maybe a limited deal focused on tight restrictions is the only achievable thing.
And the double standard argument.
Yes, that comes up too. The criticism that the U.S. focuses heavily on Iran's program while generally ignoring Israel's undeclared arsenal.
So how do supporters of the tougher approach respond to those points?
They usually argue that strong, clear rhetoric is actually needed to show resolve, to deter Iran from going further. They'd say past deals like the JCPOA were too weak and failed, so a tougher stance is necessary now.
And the double standard point.
On that, the typical response is to emphasize Iran's specific history of NPT violations and its destabilizing actions in the region as unique threats that require a more robust approach compared to other countries.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the single most crucial takeaway from all this? Trump's statement, Iran's program, the whole complex picture.
I think the core takeaway is that Trump's comment really throws a spotlight on an incredibly critical, incredibly delicate moment for global security. We're walking this tightrope, trying to balance diplomacy with the threat of force, all to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons. And it's all tangled up in decades of history, complex nuclear science, and intense regional rivalries. Finding a solution is exceptionally difficult.
And ultimately, what's the key factor that will likely decide which way things go?
Ultimately, I think it hinges on finding a way to bridge that fundamental gap. The gap between Iran's insistence on its sovereign right to a nuclear program and the West's very real security concerns about weaponization. That bridge needs building before that October 2025 snapback deadline. If that gets triggered without a plan B, well, the risk of a dangerous, maybe irreversible escalation is really significant.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? These big geopolitical issues, they have real impacts on all of us. Oil prices, regional stability, the threat of war. We really are at a critical crossroads. And on that note, here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Given all these complexities, all these competing interests we've discussed, can the world actually find a lasting, peaceful way to diffuse this crisis? Or are we, maybe despite best efforts, just inching closer to a confrontation?
And if you want to dig even deeper, think about these follow-up questions that come out of our discussion. First, how do Iran's relationships with its regional allies and proxies actually shape its nuclear strategy? Second, could new verification tech play a role in building trust for a potential new deal? And finally, how might domestic politics, both in the U.S. and in Iran, impact the chances for successful talks before that October 2025 deadline? These are all really important angles for further thought.